Hello, and welcome to History 2023 Arkansas History. Lecture title Arkansas and the West. As we first noted several weeks ago, one of the reasons for Arkansas's somewhat slow development, compared to other states in the American West at least, was its inconvenient location. With the thriving ports and business hubs of St. Louis and New Orleans to the north and south, respectively, there wasn't as much to draw incoming settlers in its direction, unless they were specifically intending to come there. And, to be sure, many were. With lots of land still unoccupied and going for cheap prices, settlers, especially from other southern states, continued to stream into Arkansas in large numbers. By 1860, as many as three-fourths of its residents were people who had moved there since it became a state. Even then, though, it continued to be much more thinly settled than its neighbors, with even the largest towns, like Little Rock, Fort Smith, and Fayetteville, topping out at only a few thousand each. State leaders, whether in business or politics or both, naturally wanted to change this situation for the better, and one way they sought to do this was by taking advantage of Arkansas's existing position on the western frontier. Indian Territory, the future state of Oklahoma, and which was legally off limits to white settlement, for now, lay just to the west, but beyond it were the Rocky Mountains and the Pacific coast. Moreover, to the southwest there was Texas, and to the northwest the Great Plains, what would become Kansas and Nebraska and so on. In theory, then, Arkansas made for a good jumping-off point for those aiming to push beyond the frontier into the so-called Wild West. Moreover, the territorial and early statehood eras of Arkansas history coincided with one of the great sagas in 19th century America, that of westward expansion. Arkansas was already a part of this, of course, as the Mississippi Valley was settled in the years following the Louisiana Purchase, but by 1830 there was a new phase of movement into the lands further west. This was fueled not only by the continuing desire for more land, the same story as in previous eras, but by the common American belief in manifest destiny, as it was called, the vaguely defined notion that the U.S. had a God-given right to expand all the way to the Pacific Ocean, creating a vast empire in which democracy and civilization could flourish and all would prosper. This wasn't quite a factually defined system, but it was one in which many, if not most, Americans at the time firmly believed. This, of course, was equally as true of Arkansas itself, if not more so. Being a state with a great many small farmers who were very much on board with Jacksonian democracy, there was intense support from all quarters for continued national expansion, even from many of the Whigs, who were typically somewhat more cautious on the subject. Not only did Manifest Destiny fuel a sense of American pride and patriotism, but the settlement of the Western Territories, especially those in the southern half, might make Arkansas a very prosperous transit point. So for all these reasons, the drama of Western expansion from 1820 to 1850 was one in which it played an important role. For reasons of geographic proximity, early Arkansas was most closely linked with the American settlement of Texas. Although this was technically Spanish territory until 1821, when it then became a province of the newly independent Mexican nation, it was very much on the periphery and only thinly populated, making it relatively easy for Americans to filter in from the east. The Southwest Trail, by which settlers had entered Arkansas via Missouri, ran on across the Red River into Texas, and a good many continued on that direction throughout the 1820s and 1830s. For that reason, there was a degree of ambivalence in how Arkansas residents viewed the rise of Texas. On the one hand, it effectively moved the American border further south and west and took some potential heat off of them, which was good. On the other hand, potential residents and wealth were definitely being siphoned off as well, and there were quite a few complaints that interest in Texas was hurting Arkansas land values. The two regions also had running disputes over where exactly the dividing line ran, an argument that would not be settled until 1841, when a national commission established it, and in the process led to the unique position of Texarkana straddling the border, and which of course takes its name from the two now states. Nonetheless, there were many links between Arkansas territorial leaders and their emerging Texan counterparts, such as Sam Houston and Stephen F. Austin, and nearly all Arkansans were highly supportive of the Texas Revolution of 1835 and 36, in which the American settlers overthrew the Mexican rulers and declared themselves an independent republic. A fascinating story that is really not within our purview, so we won't get into it. Although Texas would not actually enter the Union until 1845, it was taken for granted that this would happen in time, and that, as it did, Arkansas would gain from the continued stream of migration into the Lone Star State. Whig leaders were a bit more lukewarm on the matter, partly from fears that Texas's entry would upset the balance between free and slave states. After the entrance of Arkansas and Michigan, that still stood at 13 apiece. The Democrats had the majority in the state, though, and almost to a man, they were passionately in favor, with such politicians as Solon Borland, Ambrose Sevier, Archibald Yell, and others making speeches proclaiming America's manifest destiny, there are those words again, to incorporate Texas and all the other Western territory, partly because of the fact that so much of it, including Texas, could become new slave states. To do them justice, Arkansas Democrats were equally in favor of the annexation of the Oregon Territory in the 1840s, which was so far north it would obviously become a free state in time. When the annexation of Texas did occur in 1845, it set off a chain of events that would end up fulfilling this talk of manifest destiny by quickly embroiling the U.S. in war with Mexico. Mexico had never been happy about Texas independence or about the fact that the U.S. was now taking it over, and there were long-running disputes about exactly where the border lay. On top of that, the then president, James K. Polk, was pressuring the Mexican government to sell the territories of New Mexico and California to America as well. These escalating tensions finally resulted in a battle between Mexican and American Army units along the Rio Grande in May 1846, and Polk promptly declared war. As the U.S. government began organizing its war effort, calls went out to the various states to supply a certain number of troops. Arkansas, for its part, was asked to provide one regiment of cavalry, approximately 800 to 1,000 men. Given the state's attitude all along, the response to this request was very enthusiastic. Like most Americans, Arkansas citizens who paid attention to international events at all had little more than contempt for Mexico, seeing it as an economic and political basket case, which, in fairness, it often was, and felt they had a perfect right to take over its outlying territories if it couldn't govern them itself. State and local leaders, aspiring for the honor of being Army officers, recruited soldiers from throughout the state, and the Arkansas Mounted Rifles, as it was officially known, assembled at the town of Washington in July 1846. The list of officers read like a who's who of the state's political leadership at that time. Archibald Yell, the former governor and current congressman, was the colonel in command, while John Roan and Solon Borland were elected lieutenant colonel and major, respectively. Nearly all the other officers were prominent Democrats, too, the exception being Albert Pike, a Massachusetts-born lawyer and former newspaper editor, and one of the state's most notable Whig politicians, leading the company from Little Rock. Marching southwest through Texas and across the Rio Grande, the Mounted Rifles eventually joined up with an army under General Zachary Taylor in northern Mexico in early 1847. The opinions of professional soldiers and other spectators as to their conduct was mixed at best. Most of the senior officers on hand were sharply critical of the regiment's leadership, complaining that, with the exception of Pike, they did not follow the chain of command properly and understood little of military discipline or tactics, though this assessment may have been fueled by the fact that, like Pike, the senior officers in question were themselves Whigs. One general came to dub the unit the Arkansas Mounted Devils, and he did not mean that as a compliment. This reputation was worsened further by a couple of mishaps along the way. First, a detachment under Borland managed to get itself captured by Mexican cavalry while on a reconnaissance mission, and second, some of the soldiers killed a number of Mexican civilians in one town as retaliation for the murder of one of their own by locals. Taylor became so fed up that at one point he considered sending the regiment back home altogether. However, the Arkansas soldiers got the chance to redeem themselves in the one big battle they took part in, the Battle of Buena Vista, on February 23, 1847. Exactly how far it succeeded in doing so, though, was a different story. Attacked by a much larger Mexican army, Taylor drew up a defensive line that placed the mounted rifles on the far left flank, which also happened to be the first sector the Mexicans attacked. Though the regiment fought pretty well earlier on, some of the soldiers panicked and ran when a nearby Indiana unit retreated, and Yell himself was killed in the course of the melee. Accounts differ somewhat, but most of the Arkansas troops appear to have held their ground and fought off the Mexican attack, and reinforcements from the rest of Taylor's army helped to stem the tide and bring about an American victory by day's end. Though Taylor's army advanced farther into Mexico, it saw no more significant action, and in June, the mounted rifles were mustered out of service and returned home. In the eyes of their fellow Arkansans, they had had a good war. Official reports by Taylor and others, written in the glow of victory, had heaped praise on the regiment, choosing to overlook those who fled from the battlefield, and spoke well of its leaders, particularly the late Colonel Yell, for whom an Arkansas county and town would soon be named. Albert Pike, who had been in something of a feud with his Democratic fellow officers already, did write an account that was highly critical of them and the regiment's conduct overall, which resulted in a duel between him and Roan because, of course, it did. But this had little long-term effect other than to further convince the Democrats that the Whigs were nothing but a rich man's clique, soft on national pride and everything else that mattered. America would win the Mexican War, gaining California and the whole Southwest in the process, fulfilling the vision of a nation that stretched from sea to shining sea, and at the end of the day, that was really all anyone cared about. Arkansas leaders were especially pleased by the outcome of the war. For one thing, it put a feather in the caps of those who had taken part in the action, especially when it came to their future political careers. As mentioned a few lectures back, Roan would shortly become governor and Borland a senator, and touting their military service, as they did, certainly didn't hurt in that regard. But also, the acquisition of so much territory, much of it lying more or less due west of Arkansas, seemed to indicate that their dreams of making the state a gateway for westbound settlers were about to be realized. In early 1848, just as negotiations to end the Mexican War were being completed, gold was discovered in California, kicking off the famous gold rush, as hundreds of thousands of people from back east, the 49ers as they were known since so many of them made the trek the following year, crossed the plains and Rockies to reach the gold fields and make their fortunes, or so they hoped. Though the majority made their way to California via the Oregon Trail further north, there were many who traveled by a more southern route, taking a steamboat as far west as Fort Smith and then moving along a series of roads and trails all the way to San Diego on the Pacific coast. Some 3,000 of the 49ers passed this way during the first year, creating a booming business for Fort Smith and neighboring Van Buren in the process, and state politicians worked to attract more, calling on Congress to build a national road from Fort Smith through Indian Territory as far as Santa Fe in New Mexico. Of course, Arkansans were no more immune to the gold fever than anyone else, and many of them, not content to act simply as middlemen, hopped in their wagons and headed out to California as well, hoping to strike it rich. This was not just a case of individuals or even families making the decision. Dozens, even hundreds of residents from a town or county would band together in companies and head west together. Fort Smith itself sent a large company. So too did Little Rock, Clarksville, Batesville, Fayetteville, and others. The trip was by no means easy. It took 6 to 8 months to haul a wagon from Arkansas all the way to the gold fields, across grasslands, mountains, and deserts, and through territory often inhabited by hostile Indian tribes and, as they skirted through southern Utah, the recently arrived Mormons, who were often equally hostile towards their fellow Americans who had been persecuting them back east. In fact, a party of Arkansas travelers was later murdered by Mormons in 1857 under circumstances that remain very mysterious. And when, or if, they did make it to California, as happened to so many others, they found their dreams of wealth were just that, dreams. Most of the richer deposits had already been claimed, and all too many of them wound up as either employees for more successful miners or panning for gold on less promising plots, and often having a hard enough time just getting by. Many of the Arkansas 49ers, like those from other states, soon returned home totally disillusioned. Not all, though. A few did in fact strike it rich, with 2 Camden residents coming back with $5,000 each, a sizable fortune then. And even among those who didn't, many stayed, found other means of making a living, selling equipment to new waves of would-be miners, for example, and eventually became prosperous California citizens. In the long run, Arkansas's hopes of becoming a new gateway to the West were not quite realized. Some work was done on building roads west from Fort Smith, and pioneers would continue to pass that way en route to California throughout the 1850s, providing some boost to the state's economy in the process. But other, more established routes, like the Oregon Trail, remained more popular for a variety of reasons. And Arkansas just seemed too out of the way to many as a starting point, the same problem that had dogged it all along. Plus, by the 1850s, the further settlement of the West was no longer simply a matter of convenience or of profit for individual states. It was, in fact, becoming ever more bound up with the delicate balance of power in the national government, North versus South, which, in turn, of course, meant free states versus slave states. Almost as soon as the dust cleared from the Mexican War, and even in the midst of the gold rush, Arkansas citizens, like almost everyone else, found themselves thrown into the intense debate over how all that land would be carved up between the two sections and the ultimate fate of slavery. A debate that would become more and more antagonistic during the 1850s as their state and the country as a whole rolled down the path towards secession and finally civil war.